My family sold Grandma's restaurant while I was keeping it running, then the health inspector called. My name is Amara Osei. I'm 28 years old. For 3 years after my grandmother had her stroke, I ran her restaurant. Not managed. Not supervised from a distance. Ran. I was there every morning when the deliveries came. I was there every evening when the last table cleared. I learned the recipes from the laminated cards she kept in the drawer beside the stove, practiced them until my versions were close enough that the regulars stopped noticing the difference. I hired. I fired. I fixed the walk-in refrigerator at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night because we had product coming in Sunday morning and I could not afford the repair bill, but I also could not afford to lose the inventory. My grandmother had built that restaurant over 22 years. It was called Nana's Table. It had 42 seats, a lunch counter that seated 8, and a reputation in our neighborhood that was worth more than any of the equipment inside it. When she had her stroke, the family held a meeting. I was not at the meeting. I was at the restaurant managing the dinner service because someone had to. But I was told afterward what was decided. The restaurant would stay open, I would manage it, and when my grandmother recovered or the situation changed, the family would determine the next steps. The family determined the next steps without me. 14 months after that meeting, while I was prepping for a Tuesday lunch service, my cousin Marcus called me from the parking lot of a real estate office and told me the restaurant had been sold the previous week. He sounded sorry. He also sounded like someone who had known for a while. I stood in my grandmother's kitchen, surrounded by her recipes and her equipment and 3 years of my own labor, and I understood several things simultaneously: what had happened, why no one had told me, and what I was going to do about it. What I did about it took 4 months, 2 attorneys, a meeting with the city's small business development office, and a health inspection that no one in my family anticipated, and that changed the outcome of everything. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If you have ever built something for someone else and then watched them sell it without telling you, I want to hear from you. My grandmother, Adiz Osei, came to the United States from Ghana in 1981. She was 26 years old. She had been trained as a seamstress, which is what she did for the first several years. Alterations, custom work, clients she built through word of mouth in the Ghanaian community in our city. But she cooked. She had always cooked. The food she made was Ghanaian, specifically the food of the Ashanti region where she had grown up, and it was the kind of food that people traveled to eat, not in the culinary destination sense, but in the visiting family sense. People showed up at her apartment because word had spread that what she made was real in the way that home cooking is real when it is made by someone who has been making it for decades and whose hands know the proportions without measuring. In 1998, when my mother was 19 and I was 4 years old, my grandmother opened Nana's Table in a narrow storefront on Clement Street. It held 12 tables, a counter, and a kitchen that she had fitted out over 3 months with second-hand equipment she had sourced from restaurant liquidations. She had saved for 7 years. She had borrowed nothing. The menu was what she cooked at home. Jollof rice, done the way it is done when you are not afraid of the process. Groundnut soup. Kella wheel. Wache on Fridays, which became such a fixture that regulars planned their Fridays around it. Over time she added things, adapted, built a menu that expanded without losing its character, that remained recognizably hers even as it grew. She expanded the space twice. By the time I was a teenager, Nana's Table had 42 seats and the counter and a reputation that was in its second decade. She had been written about in the local paper 3 times. A food blogger with a significant following had posted about her jollof rice in 2014, and the resulting attention had lasted for months. She was not wealthy. Restaurant margins are what they are, and she had built this business without investors and without debt, which means she had also built it without the cushion that investment provides. But she was stable. She owned her equipment. She had a lease with favorable terms she had negotiated in 2011. She had a loyal customer base. She had also, I understood only after her stroke, not made a will. I was 22 when my grandmother had her stroke. It was a Sunday morning in March, and she had been at the restaurant since 6 because Sundays were prep days and she was always there for prep regardless of whether the restaurant was open. My mother called me at 7:30 and told me to come. My grandmother was at the hospital. The stroke had been serious, the kind that does not leave you where you were before it. She would recover some function over the following months, but the recovery was partial and the prognosis for full return to her previous capacity was guarded in the way that doctors are guarded when the honest answer is uncertain. My family had their meeting on the 4th day after the stroke. As I said, I was not there. I was at the restaurant because the restaurant needed to be somewhere and no one else was going to put it there. There was a dinner service that Sunday and I ran it. Not because I had significant experience managing a restaurant at that point, but because I had grown up in this restaurant, had worked there part-time since I was 15, and knew its rhythms in the way you know the rhythms of a place you have been inside for most of your life. I ran it. It was not seamless. But it was not a disaster either. The family's decision, as reported to me by my mother that evening, was the one I described. Keep it open, have Amara manage it, determine next steps later. Why me? I asked my mother. Because you know the place, she said. And because you're available. I was 22, working part-time at a bookstore and taking classes at the community college in a program I had not fully committed to. Available was accurate. What I was not told, at that meeting or in the days following, was what my role would look like in legal or financial terms. No one discussed whether I would be compensated. No one discussed who had authority to make decisions about the restaurant's operations, its lease, its accounts. No one discussed what determine next steps later actually meant or when later was. I ran the restaurant for 3 years on the assumption that later had not yet arrived. The first year was the hardest because I did not know what I was doing. I want to be specific about what I mean. I knew how to cook the food. I had been cooking alongside my grandmother since I was old enough to stand at the stove, and the laminated recipe cards were thorough enough that I could reconstruct her preparations with reasonable accuracy. What I did not know was how to run a business. Ordering, scheduling, margins. The relationship between how much food you prepare and how much you sell, and how that ratio changes on different days of the week and in different seasons. Labor costs. The specific dynamics of managing employees who had worked for my grandmother and who were, initially, not entirely sure what to make of me. I learned. I want to say that plainly because it is the part of this story that I think deserves to be stated clearly. I learned. Over 3 years, through error and adjustment and the specific education you get from solving problems in real time rather than in a classroom, I became a person who could genuinely run Nana's table. I learned from the employees, especially a woman named Dorothy who had been cooking there for 11 years and who showed me things my grandmother had not written down because she had not needed to write them down. I learned from the suppliers, who were patient with me in the first months and whose patience I tried to repay by being reliable and honest about what I needed and when. I learned from the regulars, who came back because the food was familiar and who occasionally told me when something was off and occasionally told me, more slowly and with more reservation, when something was right. In the second year, I made a profit. A modest one, but real. In the third year, I had stabilized the business in a way that I believe my grandmother, had she been able to evaluate it, would have found recognizable. Not identical to what she had built. Some things had changed, some things I had adapted, some things I had started fresh because the original method had become unsustainable with the staffing I had. But recognizable. Still hers in the ways that mattered. During these 3 years, my compensation was informal. I was paid from the restaurant's operating account, at a rate that my mother described as reasonable, and that I accepted because I did not have the leverage or the knowledge to argue for more. I also lived in the apartment above the restaurant, which was a separate rental that my grandmother had held and that I had been occupying since a few months after the stroke because being near the restaurant was practically useful. I was not building savings. I was not building a career in any traditional sense. I was building the restaurant. It was the thing I was giving my time to, and I told myself that the later my family had referred to would eventually clarify what that time had earned. I was wrong about when later would arrive and who would define it. The call from Marcus came on a Tuesday in January. I was in the kitchen, prepping the base for the groundnut soup we served on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The prep took about 45 minutes, and I did it in the quiet of the morning before the rest of the staff arrived, which was one of the parts of the day I had come to value most. the stillness of the restaurant before it became the restaurant. My phone buzzed on the counter. Marcus. Marcus was my mother's cousin's son, a second cousin of mine who worked in property management, and who I had known distantly, been involved in some conversations about the restaurant's future without being specific about what those conversations contained. I answered because I thought he was calling about a lease matter. He had helped navigate some lease questions the previous year. "Hey," he said. "I'm at Consolidated Realty. I need to tell you something." I turned off the stove. "Tell me," I said. "The restaurant sold," he said. "The sale closed last Thursday. I thought you knew. I thought someone had told you." The kitchen was very quiet. "I didn't know," I said. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm really sorry. I assumed." "Who sold it?" A pause. He knew this was the question, and he had been trying to figure out how to answer it since he realized I hadn't been told. "Your Aunt Cecilia arranged it," he said. "As your grandmother's next of kin. Your grandmother signed a power of attorney last year. When the offer came in, Cecilia made the decision." My Aunt Cecilia. My grandmother's daughter. My mother's older sister. The person who had been in charge of my grandmother's medical and legal decisions since the stroke. "How much?" I asked. He told me. It was not an unreasonable number for the business and the lease. It was a number that reflected the value of what my grandmother had built and, though I did not yet know how to think about this, what I had maintained. "Where does the money go?" I asked. "I don't know the specifics of the estate," he said. "I only know about the sale." "Okay," I said. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'll call you back," I said. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen for a long time. I looked at the laminated recipe cards in the drawer. The 11 years of Dorothy's presence in the scuff marks on the floor near the prep station. The walk-in refrigerator that I had fixed at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night because I could not afford the repair bill. Then I called my mother. She knew. She had known. The particular quality of her hello when she answered told me before she said anything else. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked. She started with an explanation. The sale had happened quickly. The offer was good. Cecilia had the authority and had made the decision. No one had wanted to upset me before it was final. "No one wanted to upset me," I repeated. "Amara. I have been here every day for 3 years," I said. "Every morning. Every evening. I fixed the walk-in refrigerator with my own hands. I trained staff. I kept the books. I maintained the relationships with every supplier. 3 years. I know," she said. "And no one thought to tell me the restaurant was being sold. It happened fast," she said. "The decision happened fast." "It was not fast," I said. "Someone was talking to a buyer. Someone was evaluating offers. That is not fast. That is a process. I was excluded from the process." She did not argue with that. "What happens now?" I asked. "The sale closed last week. What happens to the restaurant? What happens to the staff? What happens to me?" She didn't have complete answers. The new owners were planning renovations. They intended to operate the space as a restaurant, though not the same concept. The existing staff had been told they could apply for positions with the new ownership, but there were no guarantees. "And me?" I asked again. "The new owners expect the transition to take about 2 weeks," she said. "They'll need to take possession." I understood what that meant. 2 weeks and then I was out of the restaurant. Out of the apartment above it. Out of the thing I had given 3 years of my life to. "Okay," I said. I hung up. I want to tell you about the 2 days between that phone call and the call I made to an attorney, because those 2 days are the part of this story that I think about most often. I was not in a state of rage. I want to be honest about that because rage would be understandable, and some people might expect that is what you feel when something this significant happens to you. I was not in rage. I was in something quieter and more complicated. I was in the specific feeling of having understood, suddenly and completely, the shape of something that had been true for 3 years without being visible. The shape of having been used, not maliciously, not with conscious cruelty, but in the way of people who find a convenient arrangement and do not examine its fairness because examining its fairness would require them to change it. I had been convenient. I was available, as my mother had said when they assigned me this role. I had kept the restaurant running. The family had benefited from the restaurant's continued operation, from its reputation, from the income it produced, from the specific community standing that came from people knowing Nana's table was still there. And when the opportunity to monetize that came, the decision had been made by the people with legal authority without informing the person who had made the continued operation possible. I thought about that for 2 days. I also thought about my grandmother. My grandmother had not been part of the decision to sell. Her capacity, since the stroke, had been significantly diminished, and the power of attorney Cecilia held was real and had been legitimately established. But my grandmother had built this restaurant. She had built it for 22 years with her own hands and her own recipes and her own labor. And I could not believe, that if she had been fully herself, she would have agreed to a sale process in which the person who had been running the restaurant for 3 years was not consulted, compensated appropriately, or even informed. I thought about what she would have wanted. And then I called an attorney. The attorney was a woman named Sandra Worthington who worked in small business and employment law. A friend of mine had used her firm for a contract dispute and had described her as someone who asked the right questions rather than the comfortable ones. She asked me the right questions. What was the basis for the power of attorney? Was it properly executed? What were its specific terms? Did it include authority to sell real property and business assets? What was the nature of my relationship to the restaurant? Was I an employee, an independent contractor, a manager? Had that relationship been formalized in any document? Had I been compensated appropriately for my work, and how was that compensation determined? She also asked, were you told, at any point in the 3 years, that you would receive any form of compensation if the restaurant was sold? I said no. I had never been told that. Were you told what the arrangement was, in any formal sense? Written, email, anything? No. Were you given any documentation of your role as manager or operator? No. Did you file taxes in a way that reflected your role at the restaurant? This was the question I had not expected. I told her yes, I had been paid from the restaurant's account in a way that had been structured as wages, which meant there was a tax record of my employment there and of the wages I had received. She nodded. That's helpful. That establishes an employment relationship even without a formal agreement. She asked me to give her a week to look at everything, the power of attorney, the sale documentation, the tax records, the lease. I gave her the week. Sandra called me 8 days later with a question I had not anticipated. Do you know whether the health permits for the restaurant were kept current during your time managing it? I told her yes. I had handled all the compliance matters. Annual inspections, permit renewals, the specific requirements that changed when I expanded the menu to include certain items. I had been meticulous about this because my grandmother had been meticulous about this, and because a restaurant that loses its permits is a restaurant that closes. Who is listed as the permit holder? Sandra asked. I thought about this. When I took over the management, I updated the operating permits with the city. My name went on the permits as the designated manager of record. And when the restaurant was sold, Sandra said slowly, those permits would not automatically transfer to the new owner. The new owner would need to obtain new permits, or have you transfer the existing ones. I understood where she was going. The new owners have not reached out to me about the permits, I said. No, she said. I don't believe they know about the permit structure. The sale was handled quickly and the due diligence appears to have been incomplete. What does that mean in practice? It means the new owners have taken possession of a restaurant space that is currently permitted in your name. They cannot operate legally under the existing permits without your participation in the transfer. If they attempt to open without resolving this, they would be operating without proper health and operating permits, which creates liability for them and creates leverage for you. I sat with that for a moment. I'm not suggesting you do anything improper, Sandra said carefully. What I am suggesting is that you have something the new owners need, and that having something the other party needs is a useful position in a negotiation. What negotiation? I asked. The one we're about to initiate, she said. Sandra contacted the new owner's attorney the following week. The letter was not adversarial. It was precise. It identified the permit situation, confirmed my role as the permit holder of record, and explained that any transfer of the permits required my cooperation with the city's process, which required documentation of the transition and my formal signature on several forms. It also noted that my cooperation in that process was contingent on a conversation about the transition terms, which had not been discussed with me prior to the sale. The new owner's attorney called Sandra within 48 hours. They had been planning to open in 3 weeks. Their renovation was on schedule. Their staff was being hired. They had not known about the permit situation because the person who facilitated the sale, my Aunt Cecilia, through the broker, had not disclosed it. Either she had not known or had not considered it. In either case, the new owners were now in a situation where their opening timeline was at risk unless I cooperated. The negotiations took 6 weeks. I want to be honest about what we were negotiating toward, because I think clarity matters here. I was not trying to prevent the sale. The sale had happened. The new owners had bought in good faith and were not responsible for the process failures that had led to my not being informed. I was not trying to punish them for something that was not their fault. What I was negotiating for was a recognition of what I had contributed and a compensation that reflected it. Sandra and the other attorneys worked through several frameworks. Employment law provided one set of tools: the record of my employment at the restaurant, the wages I had received, the work I had performed, the question of whether that work had been compensated at a level that was fair given the scope of the responsibility. Business law provided another: the question of what my contributions to the restaurant's value over 3 years were worth in the context of a sale. The permits were the leverage. They were not the claim. The resolution came in the form of a settlement that I am not going to give you the exact figures of because some of it was structured in ways that have ongoing components. But I will tell you the substance. First, I received a retroactive compensation adjustment. A lump sum that represented the difference between the wages I had actually received over 3 years and a more appropriate management compensation for the scope of work I had been doing. This was calculated by Sandra using market data for restaurant managers at comparable operations in our city. The number was significant. Second, I received a percentage of the sale proceeds. A negotiated figure that reflected my contribution to the business's value during the 3-year period. The argument Sandra made, and that held, was that the business's operating value at the time of sale was substantially connected to the work I had done to maintain and improve it after my grandmother's stroke. A business that had been closed or poorly managed for 3 years would not have sold for the same amount. My work had contributed to the sale price. I was entitled to a portion of it. Third, the new owners agreed to a consulting arrangement for the first 3 months of their operation, during which I would assist with recipe adaptation, supplier relationships, and operational knowledge transfer. This was compensated separately and was my choice to agree to, which I did because I thought it was fair to the people who had bought the restaurant in good faith and because it gave me a structured endpoint rather than an abrupt one. My Aunt Cecilia was not happy. That is an understatement. My Aunt Cecilia was furious in the specific way of someone who has done something they believed was within their rights and has discovered that being within your rights and being just are not always the same thing. She called me twice. The first call was accusatory. I was disrupting the family. I was being ungrateful. I was making things difficult for everyone. The second call, which came after her own attorney had apparently explained the permit situation and its implications, was different. Still not an apology. But the accusations had been replaced with something more like a grudging acknowledgement that the situation had not been handled well. "We should have talked to you," she said, "before the sale finalized. We should have talked to you." "Yes," I said. You should have. I thought you knew it wasn't yours, she said. The restaurant. I thought you understood you were just managing it. I understood that, I said. What I didn't understand was that understanding it wouldn't mean being consulted. I wasn't asking to own it. I was asking to know. She was quiet. I worked there every day for 3 years, I said. I deserved to know. She didn't disagree. Which was, from Cecilia, as close to an acknowledgement as I was likely to receive. My grandmother is still alive. She lives in a care facility with a level of support appropriate to her current needs, and she is visited regularly by family, including me. Her capacity varies. There are good days and harder days, as there are with strokes of this severity. She does not fully understand what happened with the restaurant. I have not tried to explain it to her in detail because the explanation would require more cognitive load than her current good days can comfortably hold, and because I do not want her good days to be spent in distress about something she cannot change. What I do, when I visit her, is tell her about the food. About the things I am cooking. About a dish I tried to make recently that was almost right but not quite, and what I think I did wrong, and what I am going to try differently next time. She listens to these things with more engagement than almost anything else, and sometimes she corrects me, not always accurately, but in the spirit of correction that means she is present, that she is still the person who knows these things even when the knowing is imperfect. I find that the most valuable part of my visits. The restaurant was hers. What I carry from it, the recipes, the relationships with the regulars who have found me and kept in touch, the skills I built over 3 years of learning to manage something real, those are mine now. Not because anyone gave them to me. Because I built them. There are practical things I want to say before I finish, because I think they are useful, and because stories like this one are more useful when they contain something actionable. If you are managing a business or property that belongs to a family member, get something in writing. It does not need to be a complex legal document. It can be a simple written agreement, signed, dated, that describes your role, your compensation, your rights to information about major decisions. This document will not prevent your family from making decisions you disagree with. But it will establish that you were there, that you were doing the work, and that the arrangement was real. Keep records of your work. Not obsessively, not in ways that become burdensome, but in the ordinary way of someone who understands that what is not documented is eventually denied. My tax records, my work records, the purchase orders and maintenance logs and scheduling records from 3 years of running Nana's table. Those records were the foundation of Sandra's case. They made the work visible in a way that could not be easily disputed. Know who holds legal authority over the assets you are working with. The power of attorney my Aunt Cecilia held was real and was properly executed. I did not know its scope. I did not know it included the authority to sell the restaurant. If I had known that, I might have taken different steps earlier to ensure my interests were documented before a sale became possible. And if something like this has already happened to you, if you are past the point where prevention would have helped, and you are in the middle of the consequence, find an attorney. Not tomorrow. Find one now. The permit situation that Sandra identified, and that gave us the leverage we needed, existed because I had taken proper care of the business's compliance obligations. That care, made visible by an attorney who knew what to look for, became the mechanism of a resolution that would not otherwise have been possible. Good documentation and competent legal counsel are not glamorous. But they are the difference between the story ending at the restaurant was sold without telling me and the story ending where mine ended. I am running a catering operation now. Small. Mine. I registered the business name, got the permits, set up the accounts, built the client relationships from scratch. The first year was what first years always are. Tighter than you plan for, more educational than you expect, dependent on relationships I had built at Nana's table with people who were willing to follow me to whatever came next. The wache is on the menu every Friday. Because some things you carry with you regardless of what happens to the space you built them in. My grandmother taught me to cook, and I cooked, and I kept a restaurant running, and I built skills that belong to me now and that I am using for myself in the way they should have been used all along. That is the ending. Not triumphant. Not entirely clean. But real, and mine, and moving forward. That is enough. My name is Amara Osei. I am 28 years old. I ran my grandmother's restaurant for 3 years. I found out it had been sold on a Tuesday morning while I was making groundnut soup. I called an attorney. I negotiated a resolution that recognized what I had contributed. And I started over. Every Friday, the wache is on the menu. Some things you carry with you. END. Approximate. 40 minutes, 40,000 plus characters at natural narration pace. What running the restaurant actually looked like. I moved through the first section of this story quickly, and I want to go back and fill it in, because the details of what running Nana's table for 3 years actually looked like are important to understanding what was taken when the sale happened without my knowledge. When people hear I managed the restaurant, they sometimes picture something relatively contained. A supervisory role. Someone who shows up, checks in with staff, reviews the numbers, and goes home at a reasonable hour. That is not what I did. I want to walk you through a typical week in year 2, when the operation had stabilized somewhat but was still requiring daily intensive attention. Monday. I arrived at 6:30. Mondays were the day the weekly order came in from the main produce supplier, and I had learned in the first month that if I was not there when it arrived, the delivery team would leave product in ways that were not organized for the week's prep needs. I checked every item against the order sheet. I noted discrepancies. I called the supplier about a shortage of tomatoes that had appeared 3 weeks in a row. Not aggressively, but persistently, because persistent and polite is more effective than confrontational when you need a relationship to hold. By 9, I was doing prep work alongside Dorothy for the lunch service that started at 11. The groundnut soup base took 45 minutes if you were not rushing. Rushing it produced something that was technically correct but tasted like someone had rushed it, and the regulars knew the difference. You could not rush the groundnut soup base. Lunch service ran until 2. I was on the floor for the first hour and in the kitchen for the second, because 2:30 on Mondays was when the bread delivery came and someone needed to receive it, and I was often the only person in the building by then. Staff scheduling in the early months was one of my greatest challenges. I had inherited a schedule that had been built for my grandmother's presence, which was a constant, and I needed to build one for my own presence, which was also constant but differently positioned. Tuesdays. Same opening routine. Tuesday evenings I sat down with the week's numbers, what had come in, what had gone out, where the margins were tracking. My grandmother had kept handwritten ledgers. I converted to a spreadsheet in the first year and spent 3 months reconciling the handwritten records with the digital ones to make sure the transition did not lose anything. The margins were tight in ways I had not fully understood until I was responsible for them. A restaurant's profitability is a narrow corridor between costs that have very little flexibility, labor, product, utilities, and a revenue that depends on consistent customer volume. When volume dipped, even slightly, the impact on the week's numbers was immediate and significant. I became someone who tracked this daily, who understood within about 48 hours whether a week was going to be difficult, and who had learned which adjustments could close a small gap without affecting the customer experience in ways that would make the gap worse the following week. Wednesdays were when I usually met with staff individually. Not formally, not in a conference room, but in the 10-minute pockets of quiet that existed between lunch cleanup and prep for the evening. I had learned this approach from Dorothy, who had been doing it for years with my grandmother. Check in on people when the restaurant is quiet, she told me in the second month. They'll tell you things they won't tell you when it's busy. She was right. I learned things in those Wednesday check-ins that I would not have learned any other way. Staff concerns that would have become problems if left unaddressed. Suggestions that turned into real improvements in the kitchen workflow. The specific information that the person who runs a lunch counter has access to, the comments customers make, the things they ask for, the patterns in what gets reordered and what gets left on plates. Thursdays were similar to Tuesdays in structure, but with the addition of a call I had established with the lease manager at the property management company. This was not required. The lease did not require monthly calls. But I had found, in the first year, that maintaining a relationship with the property contact was essential to handling the small issues that arose before they became large ones. A ceiling fixture that needed attention. A question about the dumpster schedule that had changed. The relationship meant those things got handled at the small issue stage rather than the large issue stage. Fridays were the highest volume day, and I was usually in the restaurant from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. The wache that my grandmother served on Fridays was not something I could prepare shortcuts on. It required the full preparation time, and customers who had been coming for it for years would have noticed immediately if the quality had shifted. I did not let it shift. Saturdays were prep days. I usually had fewer staff on Saturdays, by design. The prep work was mine and Dorothy's, and we had built a rhythm around it that worked efficiently with just the two of us. We talked while we worked. Dorothy told me things about my grandmother during those Saturdays that I did not know and that I am grateful to know. About her early years at the restaurant, about the decisions she had made that had not worked and that she had adjusted, about the specific way she understood the food she made, not as a product, but as a form of connection to people and to the place she had come from. Those Saturday conversations are the part of those 3 years that I carry most completely. The walk-in refrigerator incident deserves its own telling because it is the clearest example of what I mean when I say I was doing more than managing. It was the second Saturday in November of my second year. I had been at the restaurant since 7. Dorothy had left at 4. I was locking up at about 8:30 when I noticed the temperature display on the walk-in was reading higher than it should. The walk-in refrigerator is not a piece of equipment you can simply decide to deal with tomorrow. We had a full product inventory, the week's deliveries, the prep for the coming week, items that represented a significant portion of the week's operating budget. If the temperature continued to rise and I did not address it, the product would be at risk overnight. I called the repair service we used. After-hours call, which carried a significant premium. The first technician they could send was unavailable until Sunday afternoon. Sunday afternoon was too late. I asked the dispatcher if there was anyone available sooner. She said she would call around. While I waited, I looked up the walk-in's model number and found the manufacturer's troubleshooting guide online. I am not a refrigeration technician. I want to be clear about that. But I had spent 2 years in that kitchen and I had paid attention to how things worked, and the troubleshooting guide was more accessible than I expected. The problem was a condenser coil that had partially iced over, a relatively common issue in units of that age, particularly in the early winter when the temperature differential between the kitchen and the walk-in was working harder. The fix was not complex, but it required knowing where to look and having the patience to do it carefully. I did it. Took about an hour and a half. I was on the phone with a technician friend of a friend for part of it, who walked me through the specific steps and told me when I was on the right track. The walk-in was back to temperature by 11:15. The product was fine. The repair service came Monday morning anyway to do a full check and confirmed what I had done was correct. I tell this story not to suggest I am unusually capable, but because it represents something about the relationship I had with that restaurant. A manager who is clocking hours does not stay in the kitchen until 11:15 on a Saturday night fixing a walk-in refrigerator. A person who has made the restaurant their responsibility does. I had made it my responsibility. That is what was sold without my knowledge. I want to say something about Dorothy, because she is part of this story in a way I have not fully honored. Dorothy Mensah had been cooking at Nana's table since 2009. She had come from a similar background to my grandmother, from a region of Ghana not far from where my grandmother's family was from, and she and my grandmother had the kind of professional relationship that is also a friendship and is also a specific cultural connection that does not require explanation because both people already understand the reference. When I took over, Dorothy was not obligated to help me in the way she did. She had been cooking at this restaurant for 11 years. She had her own expertise and her own way of doing things, and she could have viewed my arrival as an imposition or a disruption. She could have done her job correctly and efficiently and left the additional teaching for someone whose job it was. She did not do that. She showed me things my grandmother had not written on the laminated cards. Not because the cards were insufficient, but because the cards captured the what of the recipes and Dorothy had the knowledge to show me the how, the specific quality of heat the groundnut soup needed during a particular phase of its preparation, the way you knew by the smell rather than the timer when the jollof was ready for the next step, the things you only learn by being shown by someone who knows. She also protected me in the early months in ways I only understood later. When a supplier tried to change our payment terms in a way that was not favorable, Dorothy mentioned it to me with a specific framing of your grandmother always did it this way, which communicated both that I had a precedent to cite and that she was on my side of the table. When a difficult regular who had known my grandmother for years tested me on the quality of a dish early in my tenure, Dorothy was in the kitchen when I brought the dish back and she told me what to adjust, and I went back out and the regular said nothing more about it. She was teaching me and supporting me simultaneously, and she did it with such matter-of-fact steadiness that it took me about 6 months to fully register how much of what I was learning was coming from her. I told her this, eventually. One of those Saturday mornings. She accepted it with the kind of modest directness that is characteristic of people who know their own value and do not need it performed for them. "You were ready to learn," she said. "That's all it takes." When the sale was finalized and the new owners took over, they offered Dorothy a position on their staff. She declined. She told me she had been thinking about retiring for a while and that this seemed like the right time. I think she declined because starting over with owners who did not know the restaurant was different from starting over with me, who had at least arrived with the context of having grown up there. The new owners were not from this community, did not know the food in the same way, and would have required from Dorothy the same kind of ground-up teaching she had given me, but without the specific connection that had made that teaching feel worthwhile. She told me, on the last day I was at the restaurant, that she was glad we had had those 3 years. I told her I was too. She took a container of the groundnut soup base she had made that morning. She took it home with her. She told me she would make a batch every week for herself and that way she would remember what it was supposed to taste like. "Don't let that recipe disappear," she said. "I haven't. It is in my catering operation. I make it from the laminated card and from the 3 years of making it alongside her, and it is as close as I can get it, which I think is close enough. There is a moment from the negotiations that I have thought about often and that I want to include here. It was about 6 weeks into the process, when the broad outlines of the settlement were becoming clear but the specific figures had not been agreed on. Sandra and I were on the phone going through the latest communication from the other side's attorney. I asked her, "Do you think this is going to resolve?" "Yes," she said. "I think it will. The permit situation gives us too much leverage for them to walk away, and the documentation of your work is too solid for them to argue around it." "What if my family hadn't arranged the sale the way they did?" I asked. "What if they had told me? What would have happened?" Sandra was quiet for a moment. "That's a question about what should have happened rather than what happened," she said. "But since you're asking, if you had been included in the sale process, you would have had the opportunity to negotiate your own terms as part of that process. Your contribution to the business's value would have been part of the conversation from the beginning. You might have received an equity share of the sale, or a significantly higher management fee, or both. The outcome for you would likely have been better. Why didn't they include me?" Another pause. Sandra chooses her words carefully. "It is one of the things I value about her. I think," she said slowly, "that people sometimes fail to include the person who has been doing the work because including that person requires acknowledging what the work was worth. And acknowledging what the work was worth requires reckoning with what the person was paid for it. It's easier, administratively and emotionally, to exclude them and hope they don't understand enough to know what they missed." I thought about that. "They underestimated me," I said. "Yes," Sandra said. "They did. My mother and I have not fully repaired the relationship. I want to be honest about that because the story is less useful if I pretend it ended with a reconciliation that has not yet arrived. We talk. We see each other at family occasions. There are moments when we move around what happened with the practiced avoidance of people who have agreed, without saying so, that some things are better not touched directly. I do not think this is permanent. I think it is where we are right now, and I think where we are right now reflects the fact that what happened caused a real injury and that real injuries take real time. My Aunt Cecilia and I do not have the same kind of ongoing contact my mother and I do. The conversations we had during the negotiation process established a kind of mutual acknowledgement that has not yet become warmth. I am not sure it will. I do not require it to. What I require is the life I am building now. which is real and mine and moving in a direction that I chose rather than a direction I was assigned. The catering operation is in its second year. The client list is growing. I have a commercial kitchen space I rent by the hour from a facility that works with small food businesses, which is a more sustainable arrangement than a full restaurant lease at this stage of things. When the time is right, I will know. My grandmother and I sit together when I visit, and she tells me things about the food, and I listen. That is enough. That will always be enough.